Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady and I'm the online media manager of modernanalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Business Requirements Scoping Techniques. Today's featured speakers are Holly Hadyingo from Global Knowledge and Joy Beatty, Vice President of R&D at C-Level. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to Global Knowledge for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Holly to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Ben. We at Global Knowledge are so excited to be part of this webinar today with Joy and Modern Analyst. For those of you who are not familiar with Global Knowledge, I just want to take a couple seconds to introduce our company and tell you a little bit about what we do. Global Knowledge is the world's leading IT and business training provider. We create the industry's best training experience with content delivered by experienced instructors who are able to bring their real-world experience to the classroom. We offer you flexibility and convenience by allowing you to choose the format, time, and the location that works best. As we all know, you have busy schedules. We offer a large schedule of guaranteed dates so you can register with confidence. We pride ourselves on consistency and reliability when delivering our training, and our main goal is to help you easily acquire the best training possible to enhance your career. I'll be back at the end of the webinar to talk a little bit more about our offerings, and now I'd like to hand it off to Joy to get us started with this very exciting topic.
All right, thank you, Holly. My name is Joy Beatty, and thank you, Ben, for having us here. This is exciting, good topic, I hope. You guys can see on the screen, this is just some background information about me and how I got here. I work for a company called C-Level. I own research and development at C-Level. It's a professional services company, but I, in particular, get to focus on what are the methodologies that we use, getting our consultants up to speed, things like that. I have a lot of fun doing it. The good news is that a lot of the stories I tell when I give these kinds of webinars come from actual project experience over the years. I've been doing this for quite a long time. There's 2 books mentioned here. At the end I will show you those books again, and I mention them in particular because the content today comes from those books. So had a lot of fun. In particular, last year, finished up Software Requirements with Carl Wiegers. Great guy, really enjoyed co-authoring with him, so super excited about that. And with that, let's get started. This is the agenda for today. These are the topics I'm going to cover. First thing, I'm going to define what business requirements are. I'm going to relate those to some other types of requirements, just so we're all talking about the same thing here today. Then we'll talk through 4 different scoping models based on those business requirements. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how you can use all of that information so you can control scope on your projects. Again, a lot of this content has come out of that Software Requirements book. Chapter 5, if you happen to have the book already, is all about business requirements. And so I'm borrowing heavily from the concept there and then hopefully expanding upon them here for you. And by the way, I apologize. You probably hear my voice may sound a little scratchy. If you know my voice in particular, you would recognize that. I am just getting over a pretty bad and long cold, it seems. So you may hear me cough or sneeze, but bear with me. I will try to mute for that. And I'll be back if I do it. All right, so let's set the stage for talking about business requirements. There's a relatively famous Standish Group study out there that shows us that most projects, most software projects in IT are failing. And the main reasons that projects are failing are shown here. Things like lack of user input, changing requirements, incomplete requirements, unclear objectives. That's the first one up there. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I see causing them to fail. But what the study is telling us and what these things are telling us about it is that there's something wrong with that relationship between our business stakeholders and IT. There's some kind of a lack of alignment there that's causing just projects to fail over and over and over again, more often than succeed, in fact. And I believe that business requirements are really at the heart of defining what our business stakeholders actually need. So that is why I think this topic is so important to everyone. Business requirements are the things that are going to help us define what are the objectives for a project, right? Let's make sure we get very clearly down on paper what are those objectives. They help us manage those changing requirements. They help us identify requirements that might be incomplete, and they tell us where do we need user input. So business requirements are the crux of the successful or failed project, those reasons that you see up here on the screen now. So what are business requirements? Well, I like to think of them as a set of information that in aggregate describes a need that leads to one or more projects to deliver a solution, and then ultimately the desired ultimate, business outcomes. So essentially they describe why the organization is implementing the system, or another way to think about it, what's the business benefit the organization hopes to achieve out of it. So it's a very simple definition, but boy, there's a lot of meat in that definition, certainly. I find that when I go from customer to customer that people use that term business requirement differently. So I think it actually helps to put the term business requirements in perspective relative to other types of requirements that maybe we're more familiar with. And so that's what this is meant to illustrate. There's these three different levels of software requirements, and they all relate to one another. So business requirements represent the top of the requirements chain. User requirements are right below that, and then functional requirements below those in the hierarchy. The user requirements and the functional requirements have to align back to those business requirements. There's other types of requirements that I'm not showing here, things like non-functional requirements, quality attributes, maybe constraints, maybe call those kinds of things out. I'm just not putting them in this diagram for simplicity. They absolutely are in here and relate to these different levels as well. But business requirements really tell us why the organization is undertaking a project. User requirements get into what the users will be able to do in a system, and then the functional requirements are all about what the developer implements. Okay, so that's how you can differentiate between these three different levels. And like I said, customer to customer, I see that term used differently. I see some organizations think that, business requirements are actually the top two levels combined. You might have a business requirements document that has all three of these levels in it, and that's fine. Just know that when I'm talking about business requirements, this is kind of what I'm referring to is that very, very top level that really tells us why we're doing a project. And again, the hierarchy is very important here. What it means is that if you have functional requirements that don't help a project achieve those business objectives, then they shouldn't be implemented. So that trace is really a very real thing that we'll see from top to bottom in our requirements. Okay, and here's an example for each of those different requirements levels. Throughout this talk today, I'm going to give you examples from a sample project called a chemical tracking system. This is just a sampling of requirements from that particular system. So at a top level, we have a clear objective that's going to tell us why are we building the system. So in this particular case, it's to reduce our chemical purchasing expenses by 25% in the first year. Okay. The user requirement in this case is much like a user story if you're familiar with the Agile world. It explains what the user desires. So as a chemist, I want to request a chemical so that I can perform experiments. I will mention very briefly right now that I actually really like to write user requirements in the form of user stories, even if I'm not on an Agile project. This format is very clear, tells me what the user needs, but it also tells me why they need it, like what is their actual goal. And then the functional requirement level is one simple statement about what the system must do to support the user requirement. So here, the portal shall use a shopping cart to contain chemicals that the user selects to order. All right, so I mentioned this in the definition that a business requirement is an aggregation of a few types of information. So these are those four types of information: business opportunities, business objectives, success metrics, vision statements. So I'm going to break each of these down in a little bit more detail, but when I say business requirements, I'm talking about all of these different things. So business opportunities. This is our first type of business requirement. For something like a corporate information system, a corporate IT department, this is usually the business problem that is being solved or the business process that we're trying to improve. Now when I go into the commercial space, so a commercial product, it may look like a business opportunity that exists in the market. It may be the market for which the product will be competing, right? So it takes a little bit different form depending on the environment that you're in. But to identify it, we can ask questions like, what's keeping the organization from reaching its goals, or what are the opportunities in the marketplace, that I'm not right now achieving or realizing. So we're trying to identify these different opportunities by asking those kinds of questions. And again, for our chemical tracking system, which would be an internal corporate system, Here's our example. The business problem might be something like managing chemical inventories manually costs too much and is inefficient, right? So this organization has people who interact with different systems maybe, that they manage these chemical inventories, and they're finding out that they're wasting a lot of money in that effort, and they would undertake a project to resolve that. A business objective is the benefit that the organization expects to receive from the project that they take on. These have got to be written in a quantitative and measurable way. I can't stress that enough. And the reason for that is because if you go down this path and you don't understand a measurable success thing that you can look at and see, you don't know if your project was successful or not. And you shouldn't take it on if you don't know why you're doing it. So I really, really feel strongly that these have got to be measurable. Business objectives almost always can be related back to money. This sometimes is a controversial statement, I'll just say that, so you feel free to ask questions about this if this doesn't make sense. But in the business context, we do projects to either increase revenue or cut costs. At the end of the day, things roll back to that. Sometimes we have to use proxies for money, things like maybe I measure the number of new customers or the number of units sold, but those both directly relate back to increasing revenue. Right? So in the end, even things like regulatory or compliance projects, those relate back to money. We're doing those so that we can avoid fines or so that we can even stay in business. Right? So again, all those business objectives at the end of the day can be related back to money. And if you can do that, it just gives such a nice clear reason for us to take on a project and drive our prioritization to. And we're going to see what that means in a little bit. Now sometimes I hear about IT projects that are doing things like, well, we've got to combine 7 systems into one. Okay, that is not a business objective. It may be a measurable objective, but it is not a true business objective. It's really a solution to a problem. But the reality is that your business stakeholders do not care if there's 7 systems or 1 system. There's got to be some kind of a dollar benefit associated with it for you to take on that project, for them to actually feel like, okay, there's a business objective here. So you might have an objective that relates to cutting costs by a certain number of dollars, and that would be a valid reason to do it. Now, in our example chemical tracking system, one objective might be to reduce chemical purchasing expenses from $1 million to $750,000 in the first year. You might have different objectives that are things like, maybe we're going to reduce the number of chemicals that are misordered by a certain specific number or wasted or something like that. Or maybe we're going to measure the amount of time people spend doing it. But again, those are proxies that relate back to reducing the actual expenses. Organizations generally undertake a project to solve a problem or to exploit some kind of an opportunity. So the objectives relate back to those opportunities. Okay? When we look closer at what's keeping us from achieving our objectives, we can find more problems. The point of this, what I'm trying to get across here, is that this is an iterative process to identify these types of business requirements. So I may bounce back and forth between what's a problem and what's an objective. So if I'm trying to identify objectives, like if I understand what the business problem is, then I can ask questions like, how will we assess whether the problem is solved? Why do we need to solve that problem? And those are going to help me find those measurable objectives. Now, on the other side, if I have a business objective, maybe I already know what the objective is. Then I can ask things like, well, what's keeping us from reaching that goal today? And that would help me identify a more detailed business problem that I need to actually solve. Or I could work backwards and ask, well, why do I even care about that goal? To better understand the top level business problem or opportunity. And you can imagine if somebody says, well, I need to increase customer satisfaction by 20% next year. Then you could ask the question, well, why do you care about doing that? Because that's going to help you get to an answer that ultimately relates back to revenue and cost, right? So somebody might say, oh, well, my customer satisfaction levels have dropped this year, and so I'm losing customers. Okay, well, how many customers are you losing, right? Let's get some metrics around that, and that gives you something more concrete to work with. Now, to elicit good business objectives, this is going to sound very, very simple, and it's much harder than I'm making it sound, but the number one question that you're going to end up asking is why, right? You're going to ask, well, why are you doing that? Why do you care about that? Why is that important? And you're probably going to annoy the stakeholders, so you might set expectations with them that you're headed down that path. But the idea is you're going to keep asking why until you can uncover what are those real problems that they're trying to solve, what are the real objectives that they care about. Now, often we find that business objectives, they're well defined, but they can't be measured until after our project is complete. Okay, so for example, let's say I want to reduce costs by $250,000 next year, and I release this project in March. I may not be able to actually measure that until December. Right, that's a long time after I've launched a project to know am I successful or not. So for this reason, we like to define interim success metrics to know if our project is on track. Right, are we on track to meet those or not? So success metrics are something that can be tracked as the project progresses, and then maybe during testing or shortly after release. They're concrete things that we can measure, again, that tell us we're on track to meet those business objectives. The timeline that I show here kind of demonstrates this. So we start a project, and then maybe we have a few interim metrics that we track. Then we launch it, and then we can do a few more measurements to see if we're still on track. And eventually we reach a point at which we can measure whether the business objective was actually met. So to illustrate this, an example for our chemical tracking system is to reduce time spent ordering the chemicals to 10 minutes on 80% of orders. So if we can measure this right after we release the software, then we can be hopeful that our overall business objective to reduce costs by $250,000 will be met, even though we can't measure the business objective for another year. So again, they're really just interim metrics that say, okay, if I check along these ways, I check these boxes off and I'm on track, then I'm pretty sure I'm going to hit my overall objective. Now, vision statements describe the product and what it will ultimately achieve, how it's going to go about achieving those business objectives. So they paint this picture of where we're all hoping to go on the project, right? Very visionary. The vision statement is going to help you align the priorities and the activities that go on the project for all the different project stakeholders. So again, let's get that whole team moving towards a common objective. The vision statement can help us get there. Vision statements include a concise summary of the long-term purpose, the intent of the product. They might be idealistic in some cases, but they really need to be grounded in the realities of what we think the market will look like, or what the realities of the existing company that we're working in, maybe the enterprise architectures that we're in, where strategically the company is going, right? So they've got to be grounded in those realities, even if they're a bit idealistic because they are looking out into the horizon. You might encourage your key stakeholders to actually draft their own vision statements for a project. This is going to help you very quickly illustrate different understandings about their objectives. And if you're well into your project, it's still not too late. You can actually go back and do it. Pull everybody together in a half-hour meeting and say, here's what a vision statement is. Let's all draft them together. Okay? Doing this, you can actually then fix any sort of lack of focus or lack of direction that you identify in your stakeholders sooner than later. So kind of a neat activity that you can do midway just to get everybody refocused on what's that goal, what are we trying to do. So this is the format for a vision statement. We'll look at an example in a moment. The key components to it are things like who is the product targeted for? What is their need in what is their opportunity? What is the actual product called? How are we going to all refer to it the same? What type of product is it? What are the major capabilities, key benefits, reasons to buy, maybe the features, like what are the top 5 features that we're really building into it? How does it differentiate from other solutions? And then a concise statement about the value of this product. Now, when you're writing your vision statements, you may not complete all of these, but you should at least try and to figure out why you're not completing some of them. That in itself could be telling. And let me show you. This is a partial example for our chemical tracking system. If I put the entire thing up here, your eyes would kind of glaze over in a presentation format, but this will give you an idea of the kind of statements that you'd be writing. And I've put those keywords from the previous slide are in bold, right? So for scientists who need to request containers of chemicals, the chemical tracking system, that's what we're calling it, is an information system that will provide a single point of access to the chemical stockroom and to vendors, and I'm not going to read that all to you because you guys, I think, probably get the point. Now, the vision statement applies to the product as a whole, and the overall vision in truth, should change relatively slowly as a product's strategic positioning or as the company's business objectives evolve over time, right? So vision is something that you can think about kind of long term and paint that picture. Now, when we talk about the concept of scope, which I'm about to switch to a little bit more details on that, but the concept of scope really pertains to a specific project or maybe even an iteration within a project that we're going to implement and then maybe the next increment of the product's functionality, okay? So scope is more dynamic than vision because the stakeholders adjust the contents of each release within its schedule, budget, whatever constraints we have to work with. So the scope for the current release that we're working on should be pretty clear, right? We know what our constraints are. Let's define that scope. As we look out in the future towards fulfilling the rest of our vision, the scope of future releases is going to certainly be much, much fuzzier than what we know today. And that's what this diagram is trying to show you. As we go to the right, that scope gets pretty fuzzy. Right? And again, this is applicable whether you're doing waterfall or agile or some other incremental iterative approach to development. Right? These scope releases that I'm showing here could be 2 weeks, they could be 6 months, they could be 2 years. But the point is the thing I'm working on now, that scope boundary needs to be very, very clear. And as I look forward, it's less clear. Okay? So what you can do in any of these approaches to your development methodology is to build a roadmap for subsequent releases. Plan the scope statements are going to change over time, though. And know, those distant ones are going to be fuzzy. So just expect that kind of uncertainty as you look out into the future. Okay, let's now talk about 4 different scope models. So even if you have a solid product vision, the product's going to fail if you don't manage your scope. Point blankly, I'm just going to say that. So I'm going to talk about 4 different visual models that you can use. I'm going to go into each of these in a bit more detail, but if you have defined clear business requirements, then everything within these 4 models has got to relate back to those business requirements. The collection of business requirements and these 4 scope models is what's going to help you put a boundary on the scope of your product, right? So it's not either or. You need to do those business requirements and you need to create these models to make sure you really understand the scope of your project. The first scope model is the context diagram. This defines a scope boundary on the system and its connections to all the external entities that interface to that system in some way. Now, the system is typically going to be shown in a circle. It's usually in the center of a diagram, and I'm going to show you an example in a minute. It encompasses, it could be software, it could be hardware, any human components to the thing that you're working on. Now, the boxes are your external entities. Those are the things that interface with the system, and they could be groups of users, they could be other systems, they could be hardware. And then the lines are going to show data or physical objects that are flowing between your system and the external entity. The arrow tells you the direction of that flow. So in this particular case, we have data flowing from the external entity into the system. Now, some people think of this as a top-level data flow diagram because you can, in fact, show data or other information flowing to and from the other systems. I personally treat it a little different than data flow diagrams. I think it's fine if you want to make that connection. The idea, though, is you're showing data flowing across these lines. Now, this model only shows entities that interact directly with your system. It's a very important distinction between this model and the next model I'm going to show you, so I'll touch on that when I get to it. Just hold on to that thought for a minute, that this model is really just, here's my system and the things that directly interface to it. And here's our chemical tracking system example context diagram, or at least a partial example probably. In this case, and let's look at an example here. We have the buyer on the upper left. The buyer is an external entity. Let's assume for the moment that's an actual person called a buyer. She's taking a vendor chemical request from our system. She does something with it. We're not going to specify that here. That's not part of this diagram. And then she or her system can pass that vendor order status back to the system. So maybe she pulls in the vendor chemical request, she does something with it, and then she enters something into another little system and it directly passes vendor order status back to the chemical tracking system. Right, so another case, maybe we're going to have a barcode reader and it's taking the scanned barcode and feeding that directly into our system. That's basically how you read this diagram. Pretty straightforward. Again, very, very helpful to understand what are all the different interface points that I need to worry about when I'm building my system. Our second scope model is the ecosystem map. This is one of my favorite models. I will preface this by telling you this. I think that probably almost every one of the projects I've worked on, we create these. So this model illustrates all of the systems related to the system that's being developed. And it's helping us to make sure we know all the interfaces that we're going to have requirements for. Okay, so I've got all these different systems that are in boxes. And maybe I bold mine. There's a little bit of a bolder line around the one there. You can do that or not. But the idea is the boxes are going to be the systems, and the arrows are going to show the major data objects flowing between systems and the direction of that flow. Thus far, what I'm telling you sounds a lot like a context diagram, right? The key difference between this and a context diagram is that this one shows systems that may not be interfacing directly to our system. The reason we're showing them, though, is because they influence it directly, all right? So I'm going to walk through what I mean by that. I've got here at the bottom a system that passes data to another system. That system passes it to our system, okay? This helps us know that there's interfaces out there that we have to develop, but it also tells me downstream or upstream impacts that our system might have. So even if I don't have to build an interface to a particular system, I may very much care about the data that is getting passed to me from that system and the format of that data. Or maybe I'm passing system data to a system that passes it to another system. I need to understand what that other system is expecting so that I make sure I'm getting the information that needs to go. So to create one of these, we identify any affected systems by basically following the data consumption and where is that data produced. We follow those lines, and those tell us where we need to have boxes in our diagram. The nature of this model is there's going to be some overlap with your context diagram. Okay? Some of your external entities in the other diagram are in fact systems, and they show up in this diagram too, same with some of the data flow. But you will have things in this diagram that are not in the other one. Okay, you're going to have some systems in here that don't directly interface with your system. So they would show up here, not in the other one. And I should also mention, on ecosystem maps, I really only show systems. I wouldn't bother with showing data, or sorry, not data, groups of users or people. All right, so let's look at an example from our chemical tracking system. This is a portion of an ecosystem map. So in this case, you can see how the chemical tracking system is going to pass a request to the purchasing system, and that system then passes orders to a vendor. Okay, so I'm starting in the middle, and I'm looking straight up, and then to the left, I'm passing something to the vendor. Now, even though the chemical tracking system doesn't talk to the vendor directly, we benefit by showing that the request is going to be turned into an order that goes to the vendor. That might help us know that we need to include certain data fields in that request that we pass off. Right, so we're making sure the purchasing system has what it needs to pass the information to the vendor. And you can imagine that could even turn into user interface requirements, right? There may be some fields that I need to be capturing in the user interface of a chemical tracking system in order to make sure that this order thing that's 2 systems away is done correctly for the vendor. And so this diagram is all about helping understand what are the possible interfaces I have to develop, but also what are the interfaces that I may end up being influenced by or influencing. All right, our third scope model is the feature tree. This depicts the product's features organized into logical groups. We hierarchically subdivide our features into further detail here. So the product's going to be in an oval on that straight line across the top. The top level features, we also call those L1 features, or for level 1. Those are going to be in boxes. Then we're going to have sub-features to the L1. Those are called L2 features. And then we would have L3 features that are sub-features to the L2, and they're going to be called L3 features. And you can see how the sub-features are always hanging off the branch of the feature that they're a sub-feature to. So what we love about this particular model is it's a very concise view of all the planned features. It fits in one page. This typically will show up to 3 levels on a given system very, very cleanly. I don't necessarily ever see many reasons to go to more depth than that anyway. One of the things we love about this is that it's actually a great model to show executives. It tells them in one page, here's a quick overview of the functionality that they can expect to see. Right, so you can imagine somebody like the CIO doesn't have time to go through an entire requirements document, but boy, you can show them one page and say, here's everything we're building, gives them an idea what that system's going to look like when they're done. And then this is kind of a neat one. You can play around with colors on this. You could highlight different features as being in scope or out of scope as one way to use either colors or some kind of a patterning. Here we've got green to show what's in scope, for example. And here's the example from our chemical tracking system. Okay, so we have the order chemicals level 1 feature up at the top, and underneath that you can see we have search and then chemical requests, or L2 features that are hanging off that branch. And then we have lots of L3 features on each of those branches. So notice that some of the branches again are green. Let's say that maybe that just means we're going to include them in our initial release. But others are slated for later releases. Maybe we show those in gray, and then black means we just haven't put them in the release at all. Right, so this is kind of showing me this is what current scope boundary is for features in release 1. Release 2, I've got that planned. Release 3, don't know yet. Right, those are the black ones, and we may come back and add them later. And so this is a great model, can show you the big picture of everything that we're going to get developed. And our fourth scope model, the event list. So this identifies external events that could trigger behavior in the system. It might reflect actions or business events that are taken by external entities from our context diagram. It could be actors in a use case, things that they're doing. It could be systems in the ecosystem map that maybe trigger behavior in our system. It could also reflect time-triggered events, after a certain period of time, maybe a particular report has to get run and there's a clock that's ticking that makes that happen. Sometimes we use this model to manage scope by allocating specific events to specific releases, so events that were going to happen. We may say, hey, we're going to build this set of release 1. And let me show you what that looks like in our chemical tracking system. So example events would be things like a chemist is placing a request, or maybe a vendor indicating a back order. Or a timing event could be something like it's time to generate an OSHA compliance report. So notice how we've also used brackets to indicate what's in scope for this release or others, right? So the top set of brackets is here's the events that we're going to handle now, and then the green one is going to show us, green is going to show us events that were going to happen later. You don't have to use brackets. Obviously, that's nice for a PowerPoint slide, but you could simply track this in a spreadsheet and have a column that tells the release numbering on it. So this is pretty, not necessarily practical, though, in the reality. I understand that. All right. Now that we've seen the 4 scope models, I'm actually going to take a drink of water. Okay. And so, again, let's just remember that they were context diagram, ecosystem map, feature tree, and event list. Now I want to talk about how we actually use those things to control our scope, which is the all-important thing. Okay, so here's the thing. Let's say you're creating these requirements and you're creating your scope models, and then you document them. Maybe you put them in a requirements tool. Maybe you just put them in a requirements document, like a business requirements document, or a vision and scope document. Okay, great start. That's awesome. But here's the key. And you've all seen this before. Don't assume that people are reading any of that. And more importantly, if they did, don't assume they're going to remember what's in it. I don't ever want to hear people say, well, 3 months ago they signed off on that objective. Yeah, they probably don't remember it. That's just the reality of it, is maybe it wasn't a big thing, maybe a big event in their lives. They don't remember all the objectives with the problems, right? They don't remember exactly what was in the scope model. So knowing that's the case, our job is to proactively communicate the scope to our stakeholders, right? And by our, I mean the business analysts, the product managers, the project managers. Everybody's really responsible for making sure that scope gets communicated clearly and frequently. So, for example, if you're doing elicitation sessions, you can actually use that as an opportunity to remind people what the scope is. You can do it at the beginning of every single meeting. Something that I've seen done is you could actually just hang the scope models on walls. If the team is co-located, clearly that doesn't work if you're a global team. But I've been in a case where entire team was in one place, and so they had one wall where they just printed out in big pieces of paper what are the different objectives that we're working towards, right? You hang up the ecosystem map so everybody can come. You just come quickly look at it. You need a reference point, right? But if nothing else, every time I walk by it to go to the cafeteria, I see it, right? It's in the back of my mind. Oh, that's right, that's on the wall. Don't forget about that scope. So a lot of times we actually will start elicitation meetings by showing our business objectives very quickly. You're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you're going to say something like, okay, before we do this elicitation topic, let's all remember, here's what we're trying to accomplish. This is why we're doing this project. So then when somebody starts to suggest something that seems a bit outside of scope, then we can bring out the appropriate model and check. Or we can remind them, hey, wait, I don't think that relates to our business objective that we're on. Right? So again, the goal here is everybody knows what's in or out of scope, and they can know it in one quick glance with these different models. Especially, if you're doing a meeting to decide what's in or out of scope, display those business objectives, put the vision up there, maybe put the scope models out. You could even just hang them around the room for the session that you're in so that people can very quickly judge for themselves whether a proposed requirement is in or out of scope. So you're trying to enable your stakeholders to help manage scope, I guess is what I'm saying. Now, of course, cutting unnecessary scope at the beginning presumes that we actually have good business requirements as a basis for controlling scope. But if you do have business requirements, good business requirements, and I'm sure you all will after this webinar, then you can use those to determine what requirements are in or out of scope early in each release cycle. So the business objectives are kind of the most important factor for making those scope decisions. And we can actually quantify the value of requirements and cut things that don't add sufficient benefit. Or at the very least, we can delay them to future releases. So what I'm saying is we can actually look at, maybe a set of requirements like a feature, and I can decide, wow, does that thing, it only adds $10,000 of benefit, and I'm trying to get to $1 million business objective. Wow, it hardly even helps. And oh, by the way, it cost me $8,000 to build the thing. I can use those kind of pieces of information to just start cutting scope. So the idea is if I can quantify that value, I can start to do this throughout the project duration. Now the key here is that just because something is within a scope boundary doesn't mean it is within the project's budget or time frame. Okay, so we need something that can further help us make that determination about scope. So let me look at this in a little more detail with you. This is a model called an objective chain. And what it does is it ties requirements back to our business objectives, and it assigns a benefit for each requirement or set of requirements. Sometimes we can call these feeders, those things on the right in the purple. These are basically links in a hierarchy that tell us how much the requirements are going to contribute to the overall business objective. Now, if we know this, then we can select and eliminate requirements based on facts rather than emotions. Because I'm sure most of you have at one point or another had the experience where, somebody high up in the organization said, I have to have this particular feature. And your gut was, boy, that doesn't seem like it's very important. Right? This is how you arm yourself with data to help have that conversation about, look, this is what you're asking for and what it adds. Do you really want it? And you're letting them make that decision with data. So what we do is we evaluate each requirement to determine how much is going to contribute. And I will suggest that you group requirements together so that you're only doing this comparison on 10 to 20 things at a time. You don't actually have to do it on every functional requirement or anything like that. You can group them and do it on things like features. Okay? The other thing that's important is you don't have to be precise. You're really just trying to get yourself to an order of magnitude. Okay? So it doesn't matter if it's 9,500 or it's 10,000. The idea is that it's roughly a $10,000 thing. So ultimately we'll come up with things like saying requirements or sets of requirements contribute, $1,000 or $100,000, maybe $500,000 towards a business objective. And then you can use the same concept throughout project duration. So when an executive says to you, hey, I need this new feature, you're doing the quantitative analysis, you're putting it right back into this model, and you're going to figure out how to help them make the right business decision. So this is complicated, I think. Let me look at an example with you. So for our chemical tracking system, imagine that we have a few high-level features, things like stockroom inventory recording and chemical container images. Okay, that's underneath that X there. The stockroom inventory recording This is what is used so the system knows what's in the actual stockroom, and that can be then compared to what the lab assistants are requesting for chemicals. The chemical container images are actual pictures of the chemical container. So maybe the lab assistant is requesting a chemical. They can see in the system what that chemical looks like to make sure they're requesting the right thing, right? Now remember, our objective here on this project was to cut $250,000 in costs, okay? So keep that in mind for a minute. Now the stockroom recording equipment, let's analyze that one. We're going to take it from right over here up to the left, right? So the stockroom recording requirement helps contribute to our business objective because if the lab assistant knows what's in the stockroom, they can avoid buying chemicals that are already in stock. Now, maybe our data, and we have to have this data in this case, not buying chemicals that are already in stock saves on average $200 per chemical, right? And we know that last year we bought about 500 chemicals that we didn't really need. They were actually in stock. So we do the math of 200 times 500, and we end up with our benefit over here on the right, okay? So I am absolutely doing simple math to get there. Second feature. Similarly, in this case, the images are going to help the user so they don't make accidental purchases because they're going to be able to see it. They're going to recognize the container and be like, yeah, that's the thing I need. But what we learned is that this only happened about 50 times per year, okay? So $200 still average per chemical, and I only do it 50 times a year. Well, there you go. My benefit's much, much smaller, okay? So just looking at these two features alone, one of them contributes to our overall objective significantly, the other doesn't. So it seems pretty obvious in this case we would probably build the stockroom inventory recording feature, but we would cut the container images feature, right? And these are just two features. I just want to demonstrate, though, a simple example for you on how we can tell, you know, one feature is worthwhile and the other maybe isn't. And I will tell you, the reason why this is so important is it's very, very easy to arbitrarily start adding in features because they seem small. And I put small in quotes, but you can't see it because it's a webinar. In my mind, it's in quotes. But in the problem is that in aggregate, these small features all, they add up, right? There's a lot of cost. There's a lot of risk in us trying to build these many, many little features, right? And the reality is actually that we don't use them anyway. So there's an interesting statistic that 65% of features are rarely or never used. So wouldn't it be great if we could cut them before we ever wasted all that time building them, right? So it helps us have a chance at actually being successful in our projects, bringing them in on time if we can just cut the unnecessary stuff that we really, really don't need. And it's always interesting to me. We do an exercise with students of ours sometimes where we have them actually starting to play the role of developer, and they're effectively building out a system on paper. And it's funny because all you do is you give them a hint of what the objectives are and some hint of what the requirements are. When they go through this exercise, they get so into it, they have so much fun that they start embellishing their solutions on paper. And they're having fun with it, and they think it's funny and it's all that. And it's perfect because it makes the point. It really drives it home that, you know what, it is so easy to increase scope without even realizing you're increasing scope. Right? And that's why models like this are so, so important, is people aren't doing it because they're trying to be badly behaved. They're not, you know, trying to mess with their scope boundaries. They're having fun. They're getting into their job. And so they don't recognize the impact of that. They don't recognize how much it actually costs to add stuff that isn't necessarily required by our system. So, and that's the objective chain. Really, really valuable model. Again, keep it down to 10 to 20 things on the right side that you're trying to compare, or you're going to end up in some really detailed analysis paralysis. Oh, one more point I want to make about this. The numbers that you see in here, like the $200 average per chemical or the 500, generally speaking, you probably have the data, or you can make pretty good assumptions about what those data numbers are in your organization. If you don't have the data and you are making an assumption, write it down. And that's important to track, because if you ever find more data that tells you that assumption was wrong, then you can go back and see what the impact was and make some shifts accordingly. The other thing is sometimes you'll find industry standard metrics can help you on this. We did an example of this with a training vendor, not a training vendor, sorry, like a training portal that we were building, and there were some, you know, industry metrics we could pull around how many people would likely hit the training portal that they were putting in place. Okay. Now, quantifying the value of features or requirements helps us to really understand or to identify how our top-level requirements tie back to our business objectives. But this is key. We've got to make sure that we maintain that traceability throughout our entire requirements hierarchy. Right? So any requirement that can't be tied back to the business objective, it's out of scope. Right? So you can imagine if I had a red functional requirement sitting outside this boundary line here, that line should probably get cut. There should not, it's outside the scope boundary, or it doesn't tie back to the business objective. That functional requirement absolutely should not get built. Now, that's all well and good if the scope never changes, or if the business never changes their mind about the requirements. But the reality is that requirements are likely going to change as you proceed, okay? That's how projects work today. And scope change isn't a bad thing if it helps you steer the project towards satisfying those evolving customer needs. Okay, so this is important. I think sometimes people think that scope change is a bad thing. It's not. It's often a very, very good thing. And in fact, Agile is built on the whole concept that change is very normal. The key, though, is we have to control it. And maybe not strictly per se, but rather with smart control. Okay? So the key to smart control is to manage the change in a smart way to ensure it doesn't derail your project. That's things like not letting unnecessary changes happen. It means making prioritization choices. It means cutting things to add new things sometimes. Smart control means we're making educated decisions instead of accidental or even emotional decisions. So here's the decision process that you go through when you're facing changes on a project. So whenever someone requests a new requirement, the analyst has to ask, is this in scope? And one response might be that the proposed requirement is clearly out of scope. Perhaps it's interesting, but it should be addressed in a future release or by another project. Another possibility is that the request obviously lies within the defined project scope. You can incorporate the new in-scope requirement in the current project if it's a high priority relative to the other ones that are already committed, though. Okay, so that means new requirements often involves making a decision that you still may have to defer or cancel it, even if it's inside scope. The key is that you're probably going to have to extend your project duration if you're not willing to cut something else, right? So keep in mind, two of these paths that we've just walked through are actually really expensive. Okay, so be careful if you're headed down either one of those paths. The red ones are the expensive ones, if that wasn't obvious. Right, so in summary, even though you have a new proposed requirement that might fall within your scope boundary, it might push less important or valuable requirements out of scope. But newly proposed requirements might fall out of scope. They could also be important enough to widen that scope, to broaden the scope of what we're trying to develop, right? So none of these paths are necessarily obvious. You've actually put some conscious thought into what's the right way to do it. But the point is that, again, think about it, make the choice consciously, especially if you're doing something that is expensive. Know that you're doing it, and you're about to cause potentially heartburn for your people who control budgets and timelines. All right, this concludes the agenda topics. So again, we've talked about what the business requirements are, we've covered 4 different scope models, and we've talked about how we're going to actively manage scope on our projects using those particular models and those business requirements. Here's a couple other resources I will point you to for more information. I will tell you what I talked about today. Sometimes I think it helps to go back and look at it as a bit of a more reference material when you actually try and use it on your project. So a couple different resources for you. The first one is a white paper that's all about just those objective chains. I think in particular it's a very complicated concept until you've done it a few times. So we've got some more examples in there. That is also in the models book, which is the one in the center. And then most of the content today came out of the software requirements book, which is the picture on the far right. Right, so that, again, chapter 5 of that book is all about business requirements, and it talks through these 4 models and a bit more, information about how you might create it. All right, let me hand this back to Holly for a moment, and then we'll pick up some of your questions.
Thanks, Joy, for a great presentation. So what does Global Knowledge have to offer? We have a full curriculum of business analysis courses that can help you meet your training goals, whatever they may be. We also have certification, prep boot camps, and we also offer business skills training courses. In addition to our business analysis courses, we are proud of our strategic partnerships with leading companies such as IBM, Salesforce, and Microsoft. And some of the brands that we offer are IBM Cognos, IBM STSS, IBM Clarity, IBM OpenPages, and Microsoft Dynamics. I invite you to visit our Knowledge Center. It's on our globalknowledge.com website. You'll find free and helpful information there, including online assessments, live and on-demand webinars, white papers, blogs, and mobile apps. Thank you again for your time, and I'll hand it back to Joy.
Great, thank you, Holly. All right. I am going to, first thing I'm going to put up a slide up here that has Holly's information if you want more, to hear more about what they have to offer, and then my information here, and you're welcome to reach out to me by email if you have more questions, particularly if I don't get to your questions here today, because I see we have a lot of them, but we'll just start going through them, and if you haven't already, feel free to post your question in the questions box, and we'll see how many of these we can get through. All right, the first one, and I apologize because I accidentally deleted who it was from, sorry. But there's a question here about government and nonprofit projects, because I mentioned that business objectives should be related to money. And somebody was noting that maybe there's an exception with those types of projects. And I actually do want to address this. I hear this quite frequently. And, you know, I've actually had some people who actually are from agencies like that and completely agree with the statement that I'm making. Whether they do or don't, they probably should relate back to money, right? So nonprofits are still trying to figure out how do we raise money, and so they're doing things that would lead down that path, or maybe trying to reduce costs and things like that. So I'd like to think that even those types of projects still would relate back to these types of things, or maybe again it's just a proxy for money that's appropriate in your situation. All right, Hugh is asking a question. Business objective sounds like a goal. What's the difference between a business objective and a goal? In my mind, a goal is a bit softer of a statement. They're very, very much aligned, Hugh. Great point. I think that goals are, you know, where we're trying to drive, maybe a little bit higher level, more like a vision. And then an objective is actually putting a specific measurement on it. That said, your organization may use the words interchangeably, and that's fine as long as you're using the version of it that has a measurement on it. I want to see those being measurable goals or measurable objectives. All right, this is from Liz in New Zealand. Good morning to Liz, because I'm sure it's quite early there. Who would you see as being responsible for setting the business objectives? Great question, and this, you know, it's certainly going to depend a bit on the project. But I typically would say the customer or the business stakeholder. Ultimately, who should be funding the project? They're the ones who need to set the business objectives that say, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And I feel like the person who's playing the role of business analyst or product owner potentially, or product manager, is facilitating that conversation. So it's usually going to be an executive level from the business who's going to set those objectives, but they're going to need our help to make sure that they're setting good ones. It's a great question, Liz. We got a thumbs up from Benita on something about that, so thank you. All right, Asif asks, how can a scope boundary be defined for the example I gave about combining 7 systems into one? Okay, so in that particular case, first of all, you would take the combined 7 systems into one. Maybe your solution to solve a problem first. You need to identify what's the actual business objective there. But if that's what you're doing, you can still use these scoping models. It's interesting because you're probably going to take something. Let's take the ecosystem map as an example. You're going to have 7 different systems. Maybe you create the ecosystem map for all 7 systems and then figure out where there's overlap, and then define, here's the new system boundaries on my new one system. Here's the ones I'm going to look at. Here's the ones I'm not. We've done a lot of projects where we're doing like maybe a company's merging with other companies, and so they're trying to bring these systems together that effectively do the same thing in different ways. Feature tree is perfect for this because you can actually do a feature tree for one system, do a feature tree for the other system, overlay them and see, okay, this is where there's overlap. Great. Now where there's not overlap, which of those features are we actually going to keep in our new combined system? right? So you can actually use some coloring or flagging in some way on the different features to highlight that. So not sure if that made sense. If not, certainly shoot me an email because I can give more detail about that if somebody had a specific question on it. Okay, let's see. Joyce left the call, but she asked the presentation would be shared, and I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. Let's see. Okay, this is a great question from Kimber. Would it be possible to go over recommendations for when to use which scope model individually and or together? Great question. So when we wrote our visual models book, we have put 22 models in there, and I make this really clear to people. I don't expect you to use all 22 models on every single project. For one, that would probably take you longer than necessarily if I use it, because sometimes those models aren't appropriate in every situation. There's a reference in the back of that book that talks about different project characteristics, and based on those characteristics, when would I use one model over another. So if you have the models book, look at the appendix so you can get that. That'll kind of guide you down the path of how to select different models. With these 4 that I presented today, I will tell you the ecosystem map is one that I use on every single project without fail. Okay, I mean almost every single project without fail. Context diagram, I would say I probably don't use that as much because I get what I need out of the ecosystem one. If you're doing a context diagram, you might not need an ecosystem if you know you're not influenced by systems upstream or touching ones downstream. Okay, so that's a case where you could potentially use one or the other of those two. Feature tree is something that we use on almost every system that we're working on either building or adding features to. Less useful maybe if you're doing COTS or purchased software implementations, or you could use it in a different way just to communicate these are the features we're getting out of the purchased software. So an event list is probably of the 4 the one that I use the least often, but again it kind of depends a little bit on the project, and it's hard to give specifically all the different rules to follow to decide that. So that's a little guidance. See if that helps maybe. All right, do we have any good templates for business user functional requirements or a good reference? Absolutely. I've got a couple different, we have templates for those that we use and make available to people. If you can't find them, shoot me an email and I'll happily send them to you. But we have some standard ones that kind of have everything in it and where you would likely use models in one of those documents. So I found that to be very helpful for people. And then trying to think, I've seen some other ones. I know actually Carl Wiegers has on his site one that's pretty popular for an SRS, like a systems requirements document. All right. Assessing the value of a requirement. How do you do that? That's a question from, I might say this wrong, but Teraz. So the assessing the value of a requirement is something where the business analyst or product manager is going to be doing that analysis, and they're going to be thinking, they're going to be doing the hard thinking about how does a requirement contribute to the business objective, but it's going to be a conversation too with your business stakeholders to figure out, okay, what's the right change to make. So the bulk of that model, the objective chain model, is created by the business analyst, and you're doing elicitation interviews with business stakeholders to figure out the links along the way. So ultimately, it's a combination of both. Pretty much true of any kind of model that we might be creating, that we would do it jointly. But it's not like you could go to your business stakeholder and say, hey, how much is this particular requirement worth? They're not going to know that answer. So you're going to have to be helping them through the process of, okay, well, if I have this feature, it helps me get, maybe more users to my site. And more users to my site means this, and so on. So you're going to walk, through that with them. All right. What is the difference? Let's see here. Sachin asks, what is the difference between feature and a user requirement? Great question. So, and this gets to the heart of kind of what I said on one of the early slides, is that I think people use different terminology, or sorry, use the same terminology in different ways from organization to organization. And the way that I think about it is I actually think a feature as a set of requirements. It's almost like a grouping. It's like I could group together these requirements that are all related and talk about them in 3 words, and that's much easier than trying to talk about the set as a whole. So I almost think of feature as a very, very simple label to put on requirements, and you could do that at the user requirement level or the functional requirement level. All right. I'm going to jump to some more recent questions here. How does the process defined, oh, this is from Sachin again. How does the process defined here overlap with agile methodologies like Scrum, and et cetera? I actually think that what we're talking about today is very much methodology agnostic. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter what your methodology is. You can do everything I just talked about today. Your user requirements, you're probably calling those user stories. You should still be doing business requirements. You need to have business objectives that help you prioritize your backlog in Agile. All right, so still very, very important, and it actually helps you make the backlog decisions about where things should go in the backlog. The scope models, those 4 different models that I created, are very often created in an early sprint, or sometimes called a 0 sprint. But maybe the first couple sprints, you're creating those models, and it doesn't mean you won't add to them or change to them over time, but you're getting the basics in place early on. All right. An ecosystem map and context diagram. Vina asks, how does it change when the data flow is bidirectional? The diagram itself doesn't actually change. Well, it does in that you would put arrows both directions. So if you have one piece of data that gets passed back and forth, then you have one line with that data label on it, and you have arrows going both directions. If you were to have different objects going different directions, you could have just 2 lines and 2 arrows doing it. And again, that's really important to understand because you've got to potentially write requirements for the interfaces between those systems that go both directions. So great question. The model itself works well whether you're doing it that way or not. And let's see. I'm trying to pick one last question, and then I'm going to hand it back to Ben here in a minute. Oh, here's a perfect one. I like this. From Sukumar. Is this similar to cost-benefit analysis? And I suspect he was asking that in the context of the objective chains that I talked about. So objective chains, very similar to cost-benefit analysis, but in more depth. And I say that's probably dependent on the organization you're in, though, so that, and I say that most organizations do a cost-benefit analysis very, very high level on the project as a whole, and maybe a couple features. I will tell you a lot of organizations shortcut that process, and their analysis is very, very weak. They're doing what they have to do to get the project passed through. Frustrating, but true. That's what I see. So in concept, yes, it's very much the same thing. In reality, I think that step gets glossed over very, very frequently and shouldn't. But this is basically I'm saying do that cost-benefit analysis on your features as you go. Right, so you could do it, if you're in an Agile project, you could actually do it at the very, very beginning of every single sprint. You could do a cost-benefit analysis on, use that data to decide what goes in or out of the sprint. So thank you for the question, good question. All of these are great questions, so if I didn't get your question answered, please don't hesitate, shoot me an email, I'm happy to follow up with you. If you have a question about the training from Holly that she talked about, shoot her an email. I know either one of us would be more than thrilled to help you with that. And Ben, with that, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Joy, for a very informative presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at modernanalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event. And we hope you have a great day.